Hello, I'm looking forward to sharing with you the story about the construction of St Mary's Church in Enniskerry in 1859, just over 160 years ago, and the man behind the project, Father Thomas O'Dwyer. While this story is about this church, it is likely that it reflects many of the over 2,000 churches that were built in Ireland in the 19th century. As I've researched the story of the building itself, more and more glimpses have come to light about Father O'Dwyer, and he appears to me to be a clever, tenacious and decent man, passionate about providing infrastructure for Catholic education and worship. I hope that as I share the story of the church with you, I also give some credit to the memory of the remarkable man behind it. Before getting stuck into our story, it's worth noting that in our little part of the world here around Enniskerry, there were lots of churches in medieval times. The best survivor of this period is the ruin at Calager, but there are known churches recorded at Ballyman, Anahaskey, Churchtown and Staganill, and likely many more. In his history of the district, Canon Stokes remarks that there were so many churches in the area, it's a wonder where all the people came to fill them. After the Reformation, of course, everything changed and the Protestant Church became the established church of the state. An aggressive building programme from 1778 to 1833 was carried out nationally, with over £665,000 being spent on building churches, buying land and building glebe houses. The Roman Catholic Church was restricted in what it could do in the 18th century with the introduction of penal laws, which forbade a range of what were called popish activities, such as Catholics owning land or educating others. As these laws began to relax at the end of the 1700s, the Catholic Church began to reorganise and reassert itself in the early 1800s. Over 1,800 churches were built in Ireland between 1800 and 1863, and it is in this period, along with Daniel O'Connell's Catholic Emancipation movement, that our story begins. The story I want to tell begins about 1840. The map of Enniskerry by the Ordnance Survey had just been published, and while we see some aspects of the village as we know it, many bits of the jigsaw are missing. Notably, there is no town clock, no Knocksink Road or bridge, and of course, no church, which will become to be located just above the S of the Knocksink in the map. Enniskerry was the estate village of Powerscourt, and its history is intertwined with the history of Powerscourt, and especially who the current Lord Powerscourt was. In 1840, the estate was coming out of a very long freeze, as the 5th Viscount Powerscourt had died young in 1823, and the 6th Viscount Powerscourt didn't come of age until 1836. The 5th Viscount Powerscourt was responsible for much of the construction of Enniskerry as we know it, but as an evangelical Protestant did not allow for any buildings for use by Roman Catholics. So there were no Catholic schools nor churches in the village. After his death, the estate went into guardianship until the 6th Viscount came of age, and the duty of the guardians was not to spend too much money and not to make too much change. The kind of attitudes that pervaded during this time is shown in this extract from a meeting of Daniel O'Connell's Catholic Association in 1828, which shows that there was a prohibition on the building of any Catholic church on land in the village. We see also mention of Reverend Robert Daly, the rector of Powerscourt, who was a major evangelical figure in Ireland at the time. Enniskerry was not uncommon in this regard, and after the repeal of the penal laws in 1785, it was common for churches to be built on the outskirts of villages. Thus, the Kirtlestown was what the economic historian Kevin Whelan has described as a chapel village, which because they were formed with just the desire of building a church where, in his words, diffuse, haphazard straggles around the crossroads. Sorry, Kirtlestown. Other examples in Wicklow include Vallymount outside Blessington, and Tomacork outside Carnew. So there was a church at Kirtlestown, but obviously that was not very convenient for Roman Catholics in the village. In 1836 we saw the majority of Richard, 6th Viscount Pariscourt, and he married Elizabeth Jocelyn. While both were from very traditional and very wealthy families, they did have a more modern outlook on society. They were a very high-profile couple in aristocratic society and very influential. I'm guessing a bit, but either because of this or because of the winds of change being brought about by Daniel O'Connell's work on Catholic emancipation, I think it is likely that a such would have been granted by Richard. I say this mostly because there is a letter written by Thomas Steele available. You see Steele here in a satirical cartoon alongside Daniel O'Connell. Steele was a Protestant landlord and a close personal friend of O'Connell, and would likely have had his finger on the pulse regarding how things were changing. He wrote in 1843 that Lord Pariscourt had given grounds for a Catholic school. This is true, the schoolhouse at Kirtlestown, and was expected to withdraw the objection to grounds for a church in the village. I think this is highly significant and suggests that a site for the church in the village was imminent in the 1840s. However, just as it was looking like there was movement, the following year Pariscourt died of tuberculosis, aged just 29. As his eldest son Mervyn was just 8 years old, the estate went into guardianship. Everything froze again. The guardians of the estate during Mervyn's minority were his mother, Elizabeth, her father, the Earl of Roden, and Mervyn's uncle, Reverend William Wingfield, who was rector of Abbeyleix. Roden was a staunch evangelical Protestant. He is said to have said that one Catholic chapel in Ireland was one too many, so even in the context of guardianship, there was no hope of any land being made available for a church. It was going to be a 13-year wait from 1844 until Mervyn's majority. As I've said, the Enniskerry faithful did technically have a church to worship at in Kirtlestown, but as anybody who's ever walked up Kilgarran Hill would testify, that would have been a weekly pilgrimage even the devout might have struggled with after a hard week's labour. And so there was a place to worship in the village, known as the Widow Dixon's barn. This was famous, or perhaps infamous, as there are extensive reports about it in travel books and newspaper articles. It was held up in one hand as a shame that the Catholics of Enniskerry were required to worship in a stable, and on the other as a sign of the dedication of the Catholic faithful, who were willing to stand inside and out, in the rain, hearing the priest say Mass. As far as I can tell, the barn was located along by the river, with one visitor reporting that a local pointed out to me on the riverside near the old torrent-broken bridge the present Catholic chapel, a wretched thatched cabin, not more than 10 yards long by 4 wide, used throughout the year, except during the time of divine worship, as an outhouse of Mrs. Dixon, a most respectable and deeply religious Catholic lady, who keeps a small inn adjoining it, and who gives the use of it for divine service whenever required by her amiable pastor. Locating the barn is difficult, as Dixon had 2 plots of land, the first across the river from where Millfield Estate is, and the second in the area west behind where the current church is, marked by the red star. Another visitor to the barn wrote that he found myself in the midst of a crowd gathered in what might be called a bawn, right under a projecting embankment down whose sides the water was channeling several miniature cascades. To reach the interior of the barn was quite out of my power, for it was filled with women and children, and as I was debating with myself how I could hear Mass without being drenched to the skin, a friend touched me on the shoulder and told me that I could do so by going into Mrs. Dixon's parlour, as there was an aperture splayed in the wall which afforded a view of the altar. I could not help admiring the earnest faith and piety of the crowd of men and lads kneeling and standing there, with heads reverent and bare despite the downpour. I had an unbroken view of the interior of the barn, the temporary altar, and the venerable, white-haired priest who officiated. The lighted candles enabled me to see the ooze percolating through the thatch, the blackened rafters, and the rusted iron hooks, from which horse gear had been removed for the Sunday's solemnity. Are still in the parish today, including candlesticks and a painting of the crucifixion that was placed over the temporary altar, as well as a bronze cross recently returned to the parish and now mounted in the church. I want to introduce you now to Father O'Dwyer. He was born in 1808 and he studied at Maynooth, where he was ordained on the 24th of March 1834. He was first a curate in Skerries in 1834, then nearby Balrothery from 1835 to 1840, before moving on to be a curate in the parish of Bray from 1840 to 1859, with responsibility for the Enniskerry district. Early archives are available from which we can trace him. The Valuation Office records show that he was leasing a plot in Lower Kirtlestown in 1842, on a site next to the church and the National School there. While the estate was under guardianship during the minority, meticulous records about the running of the estate were kept, and these include a reference in 1849 which looks like the tenancy was being secured as a direct letting rather than a subletting. This is agreeable to the Earl of Roden and William Wingfield, who gave the chapel and land for a residence at a nominal rent. O'Dwyer's early years in the district overlapped with the final years of Reverend Robert Daly, rector of Powerscourt, and this excerpt from Daly's biography gives some indication of the atmosphere at the time. Daly is noting here that after a storm at Powerscourt, he willed support a subscription to restore the priest's house after damage, but he would not give money if it were to a church. Daly, who is a controversial figure known as Ireland's Protestant Pope, would soon move on to be Bishop of Cashel in 1843. O'Dwyer spent a lot of time working on the infant years. His focus was on education, including the support of schools at Kirtlestown and Glencree. He was a great operator, a man who got things done. Two stories worth noting here are his ability to bargain with Powerscourt to get a graveyard at Kirtlestown. Powerscourt didn't like the current arrangements with the graveyard at Churchtown, as it required funeral processions to pass Powerscourt House and down the river walk to Churchtown Graveyard. In his memoirs, he wrote of the worshippers being drunk, and on one occasion of the coffin falling as they carried it, with the remains being exposed. The two men entered a bargain where Churchtown would no longer be used, and a site instead being provided at Kirtlestown. Another example is O'Dwyer securing a site for the National School, which the Catholic Church favoured, in Enniskerry village. He first secured a room in the old estate house in the village for the school, and this was so successful that Powerscourt gave land beside where the library is now for a national schoolhouse. O'Dwyer really was a man who got things done. In the years coming up to the Seven Viscounts majority, O'Dwyer was very well integrated into parish life and interacting with the important people of the parish, including Lord Monk at Charleville, Judge Keogh, and George Hodson, Baronet. Signs of this include O'Dwyer being secretary of the committee to celebrate the majority of Seven Viscounts, as well as being noted as subscribing to a testimonial fund to thank the Dowager Viscountess Powerscourt, long remarried as Lady Londonderry, for her contribution to Enniskerry. Lady Londonderry is best known for leaving the present of St Patrick's Church for the parish of Powerscourt, opposite the entrance at Powerscourt, which was built at the same time as O'Dwyer's church. These kind of interactions to me indicate a priest very well connected and politically savvy enough to be able to exert influence on important people in the locality, an approach that will pay handsomely. In October 1857, the stage was set for the majority of Mervyn's 7th Viscount Powerscourt. Mervyn's father had died when he was 8, and he was very close to his mother. Mervyn was an amazing man. It is him that would realise his father's plans for the great gardens of Powerscourt. With that in mind, I think Mervyn wanted to realise another one of his father's ambitions, a plan hinted at by Thomas Steele in 1843, to release land for a Catholic church in Enniskerry. Mervyn's majority was on the 13th of October 1857. The Father Alexander Roach, parish priest of Bray. He wrote that it was his anxious wish to provide a suitable piece of ground for your chapel, and as soon as I am released from the Court of Chancery, I hope to arrange it satisfactorily with Mr. Kincaid, the estate agent. I should be glad to know how much ground you would require, and perhaps Mr. O'Dwyer would consult with you on the subject, and also as to where he would wish the site to be. O'Dwyer was ready. By November he had a committee established, and they met in the barn, where else, to discuss the site for the church. By 20th of November, O'Dwyer had a plan of the church to present to Pariscourt. The architect was Patrick Byrne, a famous church architect who was involved with several of the many Catholic churches being erected around the country at this time. Byrne's first church was St. Paul's on Arran-Key in 1835, and he was also the architect of the impressive Our Lady of Refuge in Rathmines, built in 1850. As far as prestige goes, Byrne was the go-to architect for modern church building. The plan of the church has been reproduced by the architectural historian Brendan Grimes, who has kindly given permission for it to be reproduced here. A detailed report in the Freeman's Journal in 1858 described the church plans. The style was English Gothic, made popular by Byrne, and would be cruciform in shape, standing with an elevation of 146 feet, consisting of a nave, transepts and chancel, although we see here from the plan that it didn't quite become a cruciform in reality. The gable ends would bear ornamental crosses, and the church was to be built of granite from the Scalp, with dressed stone being granite from Glencree. The plans were approved by Pariscourt, and by the end of the month, Pariscourt had suggested the site at Knocksink and requested O'Dwyer's opinion on the proposal. O'Dwyer and all concerned were happy with the suggestion, and everything was ready to go. I want to pause here to make a brief comment on the choice of site. A topographical view of Enniskerry will show that St. Patrick's Church is positioned high above the village, with the site for St. Mary's situated below, and this has been used by some authors to suggest some kind of inferiority about the choice of site, with one church overlooking the other. While it cannot be denied that St. Patrick's occupies an enviable position opposite Pariscourt Gate and looming large over the 19th century village, considering only altitude misses the point. The choice of site for St. Mary's was both prestigious and practical. Prestigious because it was central to the village, right next to the bridge being constructed at Knocksink, itself an engineering marvel. The village is expanding into the Knocksink townland, and the church was being sited at the heart of that expansion. The practical reason was one of availability. Tenancies in the village were very complex, and the opportunity to provide a site that would not disturb current tenancies in the small area around the village were limited. The situation of this site, high above the river, was the best available. All the pieces were lined up for O'Dwyer. In his meeting in December, he thanked Pariscourt for the grant of the site for the new church and set about the next major task, raising money. The cost of the church was estimated at £7,000, and the responsibility for raising money was with Father. In that December meeting, O'Dwyer was said to have made a thrilling and pathetic appeal to his parishioners in Enniskerry, accepting with thanks Lord Pariscourt's grant of the site for the new church there, and praised them to come forward promptly, earnestly and generously to erect this house of the Lord. One of the main challenges of my research into the construction of the church is figuring out where the money came from. The starting gun appears to be on the 7th of December 1857, when a meeting of the committee at Enniskerry with the Reverend Thomas Dwyer proposes that the complete organisation for the collection of funds necessary for the new Catholic Church. So, how do you fund a church in 19th century Ireland? I think I can categorise three kinds of support provided for the construction of the church. Firstly, were direct subscriptions. O'Dwyer's place in Enniskerry society meant that he was clearly able to engage with those who were able to provide cash. 4 months after the committee set about raising funds, the Freeman's Journal reported that O'Dwyer was acknowledging funds from several subscribers, and major donations came in from local notables, including Viscount Monk of Charleville for £100, Judge Keogh £100, and George Hodson £10 10 shillings, along with £80 from the new Archbishop of Dublin, Paul Cullen. Newspaper articles at the time listed donations received, as well as who people could send donations to. These donations likely came by a mixture of wishing to support the project and social pressure to do so, illustrated by the meticulous naming of those who donated in the national newspapers, reflecting a sense of expectation about donating. People clearly wanted to be seen to be donating to the church. A second source of funds was likely in raffles, bazaars, and encouraging people from the city to come out and see the church for a particular ceremony, and buying tickets or making a donation as they did. The Nation newspaper carried an advertisement for the raffle of a mare on St. Patrick's Day, 1859, with the proceeds going to the church roof, while in August 1862 a painting of George IV entering Dublin was to be raffled. A bazaar was scheduled in the Marine Hotel in Bray, with O'Dwyer arranging with the Dublin and Wicklow Railway Company ticket fares for people wishing to come from Dublin, which would yield him funds. And a dedication ceremony by the Archbishop and several other senior clergy was advertised in October 1859, with details of how people could come from Dublin to Enniskerry for a grand day out, and specially commissioned train offering single fares for a double journey, and cars waiting at Bray to take people to Enniskerry for fourpence. So the ceremony ranged from just over 2 shillings to sit in the nave, or main part of the church, to £1 to have a reserved seat in the sanctuary. Other ceremonies included blessings at the bell and one to celebrate the new graveyard at Kirtlestown, the latter bringing in a reported donation of £100 from Mrs. Young at Woodvale. Music at these ceremonies was often provided by the Oblate Fathers and the boys at Glencree. All of these activities would have been arranged by O'Dwyer himself. The greatest spectacle in terms of ceremony was the foundation stone ceremony, held on Easter Monday 1858, just 5 months after Parascourt's letter expressing his wish to donate a site. Foundation stone ceremonies were very elaborate affairs, and from O'Dwyer's perspective it was an opportunity to raise the profile of the church building project and solicit more donations. Elaborate detail of the ceremony at Enniskerry was reported in the Freeman's Journal and the Nation newspapers. In preparation for the ceremony, the foundations of the church were cleared out, and a large wooden cross placed where the altar would be. It was typical for the crowd to walk from their current site of worship to the site of the new church, and therefore it would have been likely that there was a procession from those gathered in walking from Dixon's barn to the new site. There were reports of posts placed 20 feet apart along the route, festooned with laurels and flowering shrubs, along with coloured flags. A large circular tent was erected to save the more important guests from the weather, which, on the day, was torrential rain. On the morning of the ceremony, Enniskerry was, in the words of one newspaper report, alive and stirring, with people arriving from the countryside around, as well as from Bray and Dublin. Music was provided by a temperance band and a band of the Catholic Young Men's Association from Dunleary, or Kingstown, as it was called then. O'Dwyer started proceedings with a mass in a temporary chapel, after which he asked the crowd to behave like Christians, abstaining from drinking and quarrelling, and to show in their demeanour their respect for the nobleman, who had provided for site and funds for the church. By 1:30 the VIPs began to arrive, including the new Archbishop of Dublin, Paul Cullen, completing one of his first acts as Archbishop, and lots of other church and local dignitaries. The poor weather meant that a covered way had to be erected from the tent to the place where the foundation stone was to be set. O'Dwyer gave the Archbishop a silver trowel made for the occasion, which had a handle made of yew from a tree in Glendalough, said to have been planted by St. Kevin. The foundation stone had coins of the realm, a parchment detailing the people involved in the day, and a note detailing the church was being dedicated to the Blessed Virgin and St. Lawrence. Blessing of the stone aside, this was, of course, an important day for O'Dwyer, and in his speech he read out a letter from George Hodson of Hollybrook, who was writing with his commitment of a donation in celebrating the day. O'Dwyer also announced the other major donors. The day concluded with a substantial lunch for the clergy and some laity present. Things likely finished up quickly, as weather was so violent everybody had to run for shelter. By June 1859, about £2,000 had been raised, and it was reported at the time that building progress was such that it was ready for roofing. What strikes me in reading about the fundraising is that it was clear there wasn't much money available at the start of this project, and it was raised as it proceeded. This was likely common, but must have been a significant source of stress to O'Dwyer, although the many reports about fundraising indicates that he kept himself busy raising funds and interacting with the right people to ensure continued income opportunities, including using the Archbishop as much as possible. Charity sermons from the Archbishop were being advertised well into 1863 to raise funds to pay off the debts incurred. The third source of support I can identify is the most difficult to pin down, but I think it is likely that the local population at large offered substantial support. I am not sure that the pennies derived in offerings from the locals amounted to too much of the total costs, although reports from other churches noted that poor women rushed forward with their pence, and hats that were sent through the crowds came back overladen. However, their labour likely did offset quite a lot of cost. There are two glimpses to back up this idea. The first is that when a traveller we met earlier on visiting Dixon's barn reported his conversation with his carman, the man indicated that the locals, if offered the opportunity, would give all we could to scrape together, and a day's work from time to time, if we could get a site. I think it is likely that locals would indeed work at the site, when possible, in the Irish way of a mehel, where people gathered to work on a combined project, and perhaps more formally, where people who worked as labourers on local estates were instead paid to work occasional days on the church site. The second glimpse is a hint at this. The letter we have already seen from George Hodson indicates that his gardener was available to work on the church as needed. And that is essentially the story. Somehow it was done. The church was built and dedicated in October 1859, just over 160 years ago. The spire had to wait a few more years, and there is a very early photograph taken from Knocksink of the new church without its spire. O'Dwyer moved his attention to the building of the presbytery next door, whose foundation stone was laid in 1861. He really didn't hang about. In the coming years, he continued to fundraise. The church got a new altar in 1882, and O'Dwyer used all his fundraising approaches as before. He continued his work on education in the district, with Enniskerry National School opening up in the 1870s. This photograph is a great testament to him, as it shows the photograph of his new school taken from his new church. Mrs. Dixon died in 1872 after a long life, and O'Dwyer wrote to the Freeman's Journal to offer a short obituary. That amazing woman deserves a full talk in her own right. Some memories of O'Dwyer, reported by others, give some insight into his character, and this is one of my favourites. A priest reported a story that O'Dwyer told him about a man who did labour for him, but had a weakness for drink. But because he was a hard worker, O'Dwyer didn't like to refuse him, and when pouring him a drink once said, "Do you know every drop of this stuff is a nail in your coffin?" The man replied, "Well, while the hammer is in your hand, your reverend father," and O'Dwyer poured away. O'Dwyer died in March 1887, aged 79, with 54 years served as a priest. His will included donations of £50 to Maynooth for a church being built there, £50 to Clonliffe College, £40 to the Mater and Jervis Street Hospitals, £97 to Kilmechanic Church, and £50 to Curtletown Church, with the remainder of his estate being given to the church here at Enniskerry. A note announcing his obituary reported that in the half-century he laboured among the people of Enniskerry, he realised the buildings of his church, the presbytery, and the schools of the district. And in celebrating 160 years of this church, my own task here has been to remember his energy and zeal in achieving these goals.